Yeah. Hi, and welcome to the second edition of Dean and Ben Talk Tech, podcast between myself, Dean Bubley, and Benoit Felton. And thank you all for listening to our inaugural episode or watching our inaugural episode last week. We're now available in almost the audio podcast platforms as well, like Apple and Spotify and others. So this week has been a pretty busy week. I've been to 3 events over the last week, and there's quite a lot of news coming out as well. I'll try and cover as much of that, and then we've got a couple of other interesting deep dives into some news around open internet and some reports that have come out that relate to policy and internet as well. So first off, 2 very big elephants, or one especially big elephant in the room, is Nokia and the investment of $1 billion from Nvidia and the related announcements about whether that's about 6G, whether it's about edge compute. And there's 1,000,001 takes online about this already. But we're not going to rehash all of that. But I'd certainly say that from my point of view, there's more to it than meets the eye. I think there's 3 or 4 main elements on this. I think the first one is that Nokia is transitioning some of the chips in its radio RAN infrastructure business to GPUs based on Nvidia's platforms. And this is a sort of a longer term thing, particularly towards the sort of late 5G, 6G era. And the idea here is you can run the whole radio stack on a GPU without additional accelerators. And clearly they will have done quite a lot of work in the labs to prove out that it does what it's supposed to do, at least at today's stage. But we'll see whether that fits in with whatever 6G evolves to be. But I think a key point here to sort of think about from a historic point of view is Nvidia's heritage in graphics chips actually meant that it did quite a lot of work on ray tracing of light. And I think there's a direct read across to beamforming and beam management in wireless networks, because it's about signal propagation and how things bounce off of surfaces and so on, and also estimating where those beams go in the local environment. So I think that there's an interesting read across there. I think there's another angle on US technology sovereignty. And I think that between Ericsson's manufacturing in Texas and some of its other activities in the US, and now Nokia's investment from Nvidia, the argument could be that both of those large vendors are now seen in the US as sovereign enough. For now, at least, and especially because
I could add to that Nokia has opened new production facilities on the fixed side on US soil in order to be BEAD compliant. So this is from before the tariff wars. But I agree with you. I think it's very key to Nokia to be seen as being compliant enough, as you say.
And I think that over time we'll see the US try to boost its domestic sort of network equipment manufacturers, but at the moment, they're focused on sort of niches. You've got obviously companies like Dell in there that are providing some of the hardware, but in terms of sort of the real sort of radio side, there's smaller players like sort of Airspan and more in-building focused players. You've got JMA and a couple of others, but they're probably not up to sort of a national RAN build out at the moment. The other thing in the Nokia Infinera deal, which I don't think gets talked about very much, is the fact that Nokia not Nokia Nvidia did. Nokia owns Infinera, which is a optical networking specialist for data centers. And Nvidia also has a lot of data center networking footprint, including owning Mellanox, which is another optical player in that space. And so I think that whilst the talk is about 6G and edge computing and all this cool stuff, the short-term reality is that together they can put together a much more strategic view on data center connectivity, both inside data centers between servers in racks and between data centers for scale across and scale out. And I think that that's perhaps something which is more the near-term upside for them while they're talking about 6G and sort of capturing the headlines.
Well, certainly it's certainly the fastest growing market in all of this, the data center build out. I'm wondering about something as well, and you talked about edge compute, and so some of the takes were very much, okay, finally telcos have a path to becoming key providers of AI. I'm very skeptical about, I mean, I'm not saying there's no play there, but
Yeah.
I just don't see, I can't seem to connect the dots
No.
there.
I must admit, there's a sort of a second iteration of what I used to call edge wash in the early days of what was then called MEC, or mobile edge computing. And there's a couple of good threads on this on LinkedIn and elsewhere. But the idea is that Nokia will both use the GPUs for the actual sort of task of running the radio network, but it can also potentially reuse the capacity for general AI workloads, particularly the ones which need to be near the edge or for low latency. I am very skeptical on multiple grounds, and I have been for a long time. There are some, there are a couple of scenarios where it might make sense, but the idea that, you know, I don't know, GlaxoSmithKline is going to be running its protein folding algorithms on cell site number 3248 seems fairly implausible to me.
Yes,
there's a bunch of arguments here about security, about how do you divide the resources, how do you isolate the customer AI RAN workloads from the RAN workloads, is there enough backhaul to these sites? You know, if you're running important tasks for the edge, you probably want to have diverse backhaul. Now, there's some things that make sense to run in the sort of RAN edge compute, and most of those are the network-related functions themselves. So as well as the radio, there's various bits of the core that you might run at the edge. There's a bit of the 5G core called the UPF. And there's some maybe bits and pieces on content delivery. There's probably a bunch of security stuff there. Perhaps if you buy into the vision of later versions of 5G and 6G being used for sensing functions as well as communications, there's a couple of very specific use cases. One is you can use potentially the wireless network to detect, let's just say, unwanted objects. You know, for example, drones. You can actually potentially use the wireless network for radar, essentially as a form of radar. So there's some stuff that you could legitimately say you might want to run on the network, but are you going to be doing your, you know, offloaded AR, VR gaming and sort of random AI workload?
And more importantly, is there a business model for that? Because ultimately, that's what it comes down to. I mean, the technology could be built, but if there's no market for it.
Nokia thinks that its API platform called Network as Code is the key to unlocking that, and I think it's maybe one of the elements of the key, perhaps. But if you're a developer, you don't really want to be constrained to sort of one brand of processor and one brand of network equipment. If there's a way that Nokia can expose that to, say, some of the neo cloud companies, so it's an additional pool of latency optimized compute in certain places, maybe. Yeah, so there's a bit of a pathway through there, but I think it's to my mind, it makes for nice headlines. But the main thing here is about what it does to Nokia's radio competitiveness and performance.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, it is an important piece of news and something we're going to have to follow a bit more closely. But it may not be the revolution in the telco business model that it's been touted at by some.
No, and it's also, there's a lot of people saying, oh, well, there's going to be all these new AI applications in the 6G era, and they'll need lots of uplink from your AR headset to the cloud. And then people were then saying, and therefore we need more spectrum. And it was a topic of discussion at the Spectrum Americas event in Washington last week. Interestingly, that was a day after the Washington announcement by Nvidia of this. And so it was top of people's minds. And to my mind, it's a very, very tenuous link from we're doing a deal for chips for the radio to therefore give us more spectrum because we need it all. And I think that then ties in with the current preoccupation in DC. There's the One Big Beautiful Bill Act basically tasked the FCC with finding 800 megahertz of spectrum for future auction. And there's a whole slew of discussion over which spectrum from what sources and what's currently using it and where is it and what are the rules. Is it, a lot of people were concerned that it was going to mean revisiting the unlicensed 6 gigahertz band. That's not going to happen based on what I've heard. Is there going to be an impact on the CBRS used for private networks? Probably not, but that's not a certain. There's a couple of other bands which are being discussed. There's one which is the bit at the top of the current 5G band and below aviation altimeters that's looking very promising. It's called C-band. And that would take a lot of problems off of FCC's plate. Then there's a couple of other bands which are currently used for everything from weather sensing to various forms of military communications, which that descends into a whole set of debates between different bits of the US government, and that will play out over the next couple of years. I'm not going to go into depth on that now.
No, but talking about AI, you ran a really interesting workshop yesterday in London, didn't you?
Yes. So yesterday I ran the third Unthinkable Lab workshop with my colleague Andrew Collinson. And these are a series of events where we sort of discuss, as the name suggests, the sorts of topic that are either unspoken or in some cases completely unthinkable and are radical ideas. And this one is the idea of, could AI revitalize voice communications for the telecoms industry? And there's lots of angles on this. I've written a fair bit about it, but there's two things that are going on. The first thing is we are adding AI into the existing communication services run by operators and MSPs and CPaaS providers. And the important thing to realize here is that when the telecoms industry talks about voice, it really just means phone calls. And there's things you can do. There's some early examples of anti-scam, anti-spam, things like translation, call logs. Maybe you have a vulnerable person and you have a whisper. You trade off the privacy versus protection for someone vulnerable, and you have something in your ear saying, "Do not give this person your bank details," for example. And that exists. You can have essentially AI receptionists saying, "Sorry, you're an unknown number. Why are you calling Benoit? What's the purpose of your call?" And then you can do this in the network, or you can do it on the phone, or you can do it on a cloud platform. So there's a bit of debate as to who's in the frame for this. But there's a bunch of stuff you can do which are basically improving the phone call. There's other things you can do which are around health and social care. So, for example, one of the Korean operators has a service which essentially is like a loneliness and medical check-in for elder people. People living on their own as you've got aging populations. And so a conversation with an AI, and especially if it's doing things like, have you taken your medication today, or things like that, that's something where some telcos are in sufficiently trusted role at a national level, and they've got enough of a brand where that could be together with the health sector, which could be government run or insurance run. That's quite interesting. There's integration opportunities with smart home, things like alarms, which we already have, but you could combine motion sensing with detecting the sound of broken glass, or perhaps detecting the sound of dripping water and call a plumber. So there's some smart home things there, and then there's more long-term things of agents, and will we have personal AI agents? The thing to point out, though, is that if you look online for AI voice, the AI industry isn't thinking about phone calls. It's thinking about the AI interface to, say, typical voice chatbots. It's that voice icon on ChatGPT or Perplexity, and people in some parts of the world or some demographics already mostly speak to AI rather than type in queries. And there's some amazing work being done to improve the humanness of AI speech, able to whisper or to laugh. There's a company called 11 Labs, which has got some really cool demos on this. So I think the question is how you bring the sort of AI voice and voice AI worlds together. And we were talking a lot about that yesterday. The event's under Chatham House, but we think that there are some potential for operators. Open question whether it's in the consumer applications I just referenced, or whether it's in enterprise. And Andrew was talking about what he calls intelligent engagement, which is aligned with CPaaS and contact centers. Is there a role for telcos to take a much better role in enabling, say, identity and authentication for B2C conversations. It's like, this is the bank calling you, and here is our identity attestation that proves that this is not a spoofed man in the middle call. Do you have your proof of identity that you are Dean Bubbly? And I think there's a role there for identity. There's a concept called VCons, which essentially is an emerging potential standard for conversation records. So it goes way beyond the CDR for a telco to include, what were the details of the devices, the networks, the timing, potentially not the actual recording, but metadata about a conversation, including things like privacy and consent. And this conversation was held under that DNA or that piece of financial regulation, which means that it can't be disclosed. You can redact elements. So I think the telcos could be either custodians or participate in this emerging chain for VCons and voice conversation metadata.
But do you, I mean, not to stay on that topic too long, but do you think they're actually still looking at voice as something they want to develop? I mean, that's where I'd be, because it looks like it was very rich, the workshop, but it's interesting to me that you can point to some examples, because it means at least some of them are actually thinking about it. But I get the sense they've dismissed voice entirely.
I think the problem is that the telecoms industry has spent so long thinking of voice is the same idea of a phone call that Alexander Graham Bell came up with 140 years ago. And they spent so much money on reinventing that 100 times with digital switching, and then VoLTE for mobile, then VoNR and all the rest of it. They've actually forgot to do anything clever with it. And we're still using phone calls for the same use cases, undifferentiated, 50, we were using 100 years ago, pretty much. And I think that it's going to take a bit of a mindset shift for the telecom community to realize that you can play around with acoustics, that you can play around with the way in which you set things up. Not every piece of voice is a phone call. A lot of telcos used to offer push to talk.
Yeah.
And they don't these days.
I agree. Well, I think that's a really interesting topic. Maybe one we can revisit in a few iterations of the podcast. I've been working on something kind of very different, because it's on the piping of the internet rather than on the actual customer facing services. I've been looking into, I don't know if you're aware of this, Dean, but there is a consumer association case that's been brought forward in Germany against Deutsche Telekom, or rather is being brought forward, I guess should be the right way of framing it. So there's a bunch of NGOs and consumer associations in Germany and Austria that are basically arguing that Deutsche Telekom is circumventing open internet rules in a way that, from a tactical standpoint, I find very clever, but actually has real impacts on quality of service and the broader ecosystem. It's a bit technical, and it's a challenge for me to try and explain this in 2 minutes, but I'll try. So basically, when you're a transit provider, there's tiering in the transit market, and basically tier 1 transit providers are kind of, by definition, if you are a tier 1, you only peer. The condition of being a tier 1 provider is that you do not use transit yourself. You can offer transit, but you do not rely on transit to route your traffic.
I think most people who are not steeped in IP interconnect don't know the difference between transit and peering.
Okay, so very quickly, transit is a service you pay for that carries your traffic to the entirety of the internet. And peering is a network-to-network traffic exchange mechanism that very often is not paid for, because it's actually mutually beneficial. So it's designed, it's a gentleman's agreement. Sometimes it's contractualized, but most of the time it's a gentleman's agreement that's, hey, it's just more efficient for us to do this. Let's interconnect. And basically, your peering traffic doesn't go through your transit, so it doesn't cost you anything. That's kind of the basic view of this. But Deutsche Telekom is a tier 1 transit provider, which means the only way to access their network is through peering. You cannot use general transit to get to their network. And basically what this case is arguing is that they leverage this to force payment for peering from content providers in particular by saying, well, if you want to reach my network, that's the only way you can do it. And if I say no, you can't reach my network. It's a bit of a simplification, but essentially
basically the gatekeepers. And I'm using that word deliberately. Yeah. And because I think they have more than 45 million subscribers, don't they?
Yep, absolutely.
In theory, that could be covered by the DMA.
I'm not sure. But anyway, the interesting thing is in their late 2024 report, the BEREC actually spelled this out quite explicitly, saying we need to clarify that this is not allowed. Or rather, regulation needs to clarify that this is not allowed, because BEREC is not exactly a regulatory authority. But in the meantime, this case has come up, and I'm following it quite closely because depending on where it lands, that could actually have wide-ranging impacts on some of the telco strategies to get paid for peering, basically.
I've written and done podcasts on IP interconnect, and that's a very high issue for a lot of the both cloud and telecom people in Europe, because there's a constant attempt to sort of get this sort of network fees, and so the IP interconnect and the dispute resolution mechanism, so called, was seen as being a bit of a potential backdoor around to get network fees by a different means. I love what one particular internet company referred to that term as actually it's a dispute creation mechanism.
Oh, absolutely, and that is, I mean, some of the European incumbents have been very explicit that was their strategy. I mean, very openly. One of the interesting things, and this feeds nicely into another thing that I've been spending some time on, is that when you look at regulators and their ability to understand what's happening at the interconnect layer, you realize that actually in Europe, very few of them, and I'm guessing in the US it's the same, actually have authority to collect data on this. So there's an exception there, and it's a really interesting report that I recommend everyone have a look at, that ARCEP in France publishes every year, which is the State of the Internet report. And it's got some fascinating data, obviously only about what's happening in France. But for example, they're the only regulator who can state out that actually in France, 40% of peering agreements are paid for, as opposed to about less than 1% globally. So someone is leveraging some position to get some money out of this, for sure. I'm not pointing fingers at anyone, but obviously there's something happening there. The other really interesting thing is that you realize how difficult it is, and this is, I think, a very big issue with policymakers, is they don't understand the fluidity of internet traffic and the fact that it's, they kind of think that two networks have a single point of interconnect. That's where all the traffic goes through, and you can identify the traffic from each side very easily. That's not the reality. And one of the things that I both like in that report, and I think maybe could be explained better or detailed better, is that they try to break out where the traffic comes from, or rather which content providers which content providers the end users require the most traffic, is the right way of putting it. But for example, there's a whole section on CDNs, and obviously we know that content delivery networks are an important mechanism to deliver traffic. But at the same time, Google has a CDN, Amazon has a CDN. So it's very hard for them to say, well, this is this is Amazon traffic versus this is Amazon CDN traffic, which is actually a ton of other companies that they're carrying the traffic for.
And Amazon AWS as well. There's a lot of cloud traffic, which is mostly cloud.
Absolutely. And so this report is interesting because it's a really good, honest attempt at trying to make sense of it. I don't think it's quite there yet, but also it's way more than you get from any other country in Europe.
I think that's excellent, and I've had a bit of a campaign for a while that regulators and the industry needs to focus on good metrics, not easy metrics. And yeah, you should really almost like start with a blank sheet of paper and think, you know, in an ideal world, these are the data sets we would have that would allow us to, you know, nudge regulation or competition rules in the particular direction. And I see that for both the if you like the inside of the internet, what you're talking about, and the access network. You know, we often talk about fixed and mobile traffic growth without spelling out, well, what does that mean? Is it for, you know, mobile broadband, fixed wireless access? Is it indoor? Is it outdoor? You know, is it using different spectrum bands? Is it concentrated in urban areas or rural? And usually the pushback is, well, it costs us lots of money to collect this data, especially if we have to ask for the operators to provide it. And back of my mind, I think all that data exists, and increasingly AI ought to make it easier to get out of the operators' OSS systems, or even, frankly, for the regulator to estimate it. And I think that we ought to be thinking through the frame of what data do we need to craft the regulations or improve and monitor our existing ones. And almost like start with, well, this is the data we would have in an ideal world. Can we get it, or can we get proxies for it?
Yeah, no, I agree. And actually, and maybe this brings us into our last topic for today. In the context of this big conversation in Europe about simplification, one of the things that, in a sense, I mean, I think everyone can agree that simplification is a good thing as long as you don't determine what it is. And certainly having accurate data about what you are looking at would enable some form of simplification, as in saying, well, actually, that market is working efficiently. We have the data to prove it now. So maybe we can lighten regulation in that area. But I mean, you've written about your view on simplification, and I think it's become, in effect, a political thing rather than an actual regulatory thing, because everyone puts what they want behind that word and then pushes for the regulations that they want.
Exactly. It's like the same way that we're seeing this use of the word sovereignty, and it means different things to different people. This word simplification definitely means different things. And everyone wants things to be not just simpler for them, but simpler in ways that allow them to reduce their costs of compliance, but also simplifies away some of the regulatory constraints on competition, or simplifies away some of the consumer protections. So actually, one of the things in this report, there's a report that was commissioned by Connect Europe and written by Arthur D. Little. I've written a long article basically critiquing it. There's some good stuff and there's some bad stuff. I'll put the link. It's on Substack. I'll put the link in the show notes. And yeah, one of the things in there was, it's almost like, can you simplify the amount of data we need to provide to regulators, because it's costing a lot of time and effort to collect it. And some of that stuff you think, well, it's really not that problematic. And in my view, I think that the Commission is interested in simplifying things, for example, for innovators and startups and people who find it really hard to comply with rules. Whereas, to be honest, telcos, yes, there's certainly some areas of overlap between the different regulatory instruments, and they should be better aligned. And I agree with that. And I think there's bits and pieces where individual member states have maybe gold-plated regulations, or even just had minor differences. Yeah, one example which struck me was different countries have different rules on how quickly a customer service agent needs to pick up the phone. Is it after 3 rings or 5 minutes or whatever the number is? I see no reason whatsoever for that rules to be different in different countries. It's not something that's related
I'd
to
be
national
tempted
security.
I'd be tempted to not even see a rule for that to exist. But
Yeah.
but anyway, but the interesting thing in your analysis of the report, and I have to confess that I did not read the report because I felt your analysis was sufficient for me. But one of the interesting things is they keep calling for more regulation on players others than themselves. How is that simplification?
Simpler for me, but not for thou. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
sort of
okay.
yeah. I think there are a couple of things there where they try to sort of work their way around it of saying, well, and there be recourse to this phrase that I know we both hate, level playing field, where and you can level rules up or level them down. Or you can just try to pretend that something is the same sport when actually you're just trying to do a read across to make someone else's life difficult.
Well, I mean, in a sense, this loops us back to the beginning, but it's all about, ascribing meaning to words in the regulatory conversation that no one really agrees upon. And level playing field is an empty concept at all levels of discussion. No one knows what it means, and yet it still gets used all the time.
Oh, it makes no sense at all. And interestingly, if you use that analogy, you have to think who the referee is. And one thing you find is referees are not the same people who set the rules. Referees are the ones who interpret the rules.
Separation of powers.
Yeah,
indeed. So, I think this brings us towards the end for this week. One thing that is traditional with podcasts and we didn't do last time was to say, people, please subscribe, because this gives us visibility as to your interest in the content that we provide. If you like this, please talk about it. And hopefully now the channels, whether it's on YouTube or on all the various audio podcast platforms, everything is ready to go. Also, we'd like some comments as to topics you want us to cover.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a few things I haven't had a chance to really talk about. I was at the Fuse event in Dublin, and I've got stuff that I've written on that. But we can come back to some of the issues.
We have to keep it for next time, but it's good that we have more to say, Dean.
Oh, absolutely. And you can always reach out to us collectively via the comments or individually. And hopefully we'll be carrying on doing this, either from our current setup or if we're on the road somewhere. But Benoit, thank you for that. And
same here. Have a great rest of the week.
Thank you, and smash that subscribe button, as everyone says. Thanks.
Bye, Dean.